A very good evening and welcome to Biz1st Review 360. I'm Charlene Benedict. Let's start off with a look at your top stories. The Sri Lankan government this week allocated 500 million rupees to extend the brand promotion scheme for Sri Lankan tea brands selling under the Pure Ceylon tea label for 2018-2019.
The Cabinet approved a proposal to allocate 500 million rupees out of the funds of the Sri Lankan Tea Board to reimburse 50% of the promotion cost of the local tea exporters who qualify under the Global Tea Promotion Program Plan of the Sri Lankan Tea Board. According to the proposal presented by the Minister of Plantation Industries Navin Dissanayake, the government is expected to reimburse 19 tea exporters of their international promotional costs under the Global Pure Ceylon Tea Promotion Campaign. The move is aimed at ensuring individual brand promotions happen parallel to the Ceylon Tea Global Promotional Campaign.
China proposes a gold exchange in Sri Lanka.
The Ministry of Industry and Commerce said that China has proposed to invest $30 million to set up an international gold exchange and a gem and jewelry hub in Colombo. The proposed gold exchange will be housed in a high-rise which could house the exchange retail stores, banks and entertainment facilities. The facility, which will be an extension of China's Belt and Road Initiative, is expected to uplift Sri Lanka's gem and jewelry sector and serve as tourist attraction as well.
Australia assists Sri Lanka to stay ahead in global tourism marketing.
A top Australian tourism expert said that Sri Lanka needs to strictly enforce rules and effective management techniques to protect the country's tourism hotspots like national parks and archaeological sites from over-visitation. Due to poor management and over-visitation, World Heritage sites like Sigiriya and the popular Yala National Park face the risk of deterioration.
About that delicate balance between optimising tourism visitation while ensuring that you have sustainability in your visitor sites and taking into account, of course, biodiversity and the essence of the heritage of place. We hear much from other parts of the world about over-tourism and the implications of that, and I think the reputational damage that occurs when over-promotion and over-tourism results is something that we all need to be very conscious about and design our marketing and our management accordingly.
He made these remarks at a public address organised by the Australian High Commission and the Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority and Australia's private sector development program Market Development Facility.
Now let's take a look at our other stories this week.
Moody's Investors Services said it has confirmed the Sri Lankan government's foreign currency issuer and senior unsecured ratings at P1 and maintained the negative outlook. The rating agency said the decision reflects the government's progress in implementing reforms against fiscal weaknesses and external vulnerability and building up of foreign reserves. The decision to maintain the negative outlook reflects Sri Lanka's ongoing high vulnerability to a potentially tightening in external and domestic financing conditions, given relatively large borrowing needs, reliance on external funding, and still low reserves adequacy. The agency said the government could face significantly tighter refinancing conditions at some point during the next few years, which would quickly lead to much weaker debt affordability and a higher debt burden, especially if the currency depreciated at the same time.
On the other side of this break, a chat with a global real estate researcher on the property market in Sri Lanka. Welcome back. You're watching Biz1st Review 360. Is there a bubble emerging in the real estate market? We've got in our studios with us Stephen Mayers, the Managing Director of JLL Lanka Asia Pacific, to speak on just that. Chaturanga Hapwarachi, it's over to you.
Very good evening to you. You're watching Biz1st Review 360. This evening we are going to talk to Mr. Stephen Mayers, the Managing Director of Jones Lang LaSalle Lanka Private Limited, regarding the so-called property bubble in our country that everyone is talking about. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Mr. Mayers, let me get to the point straight away and ask you, the rise in real estate prices in the Western Province, is there a rise to the extent people have to be worried, and what's the trend like?
Well, good evening. Thank you for inviting me along. In order to answer your question, I have to take sort of a step back slightly. it's difficult to categorise a real estate sector. Yeah. One has to differentiate between the different sectors and the different subsectors within those sectors. If one's talking about land prices in Colombo, prices in what's the traditional CBD, 1, 2, 3, 5 and 7, have been rising at a tremendous rate over the past few years. Central bank biannual data is predicting for 2018 prices of price increases of around 10.1% for residential land, 11% for commercial land, and 10.8% for industrial land. Going forward, it would seem that where we are on the cycle would indicate that the rate of increase is declining, which is probably good news for the governor of the central bank, as he's been monitoring it quite closely. But one has to bear in mind that there's the elephant in the room, if you like, is Port City, that's coming on stream probably in 2019 now. It was scheduled to come on stream in 2018, but now looks more likely to be 2019. There's 600 acres there, 270 hectares of development land, which will obviously radically alter the dynamics of the market within the traditional CBD. And when you look at Colombo as a metropolitan district, you have prices in, say, Malabe at below 1 million rupees, Lankan rupees per perch, up to, in Colombo 1, reported prices, asking prices, certainly around 30 million per perch. So you can understand there's a huge disparity between the two. Port City will radically alter the dynamics of the market because the land will be sold in American terminology shovel-ready condition. You'll know exactly what you're buying. You'll have a price per square metre as opposed to perch. The planning will already be in place with the UDA. You'll have the boundaries defined. You'll have access defined. You'll have the utilities laid on. So it's going to change the dynamics of the market. How that plays out in the coming years remains to be seen. But overall, the term bubble is not entirely correct. It doesn't really apply to the land prices. If at all, it would apply to high-end condominium apartment sales. But a bubble is characterised by excessive lending in the system. Now, today, with the most recent available statistics from around 2015-2016, bank exposure to the real estate sector peaked at 34%. It's declined since to around 25%, 60% of that being mortgage lending. Now, in another geography, take the UK for example, the figure would be more like 50%. So there isn't really an excessive amount of lending in the market as we speak. It is somewhat clouded by a trend or a suspicion that lending towards the SME sector may be being diverted into the real estate sector, but obviously that's very difficult to quantify. It's anecdotal, it's rumour, and again, that's a part of a challenge with this market because there's no hard data, there's certainly no contemporary data, there's no digital centralised land registry that's available to the public, so it enables the spread of rumour and gossip to flourish, whereas if that data were readily available, you could prove the theory or disprove it immediately.
When you take a look at what's happening in the real estate market right now, now you say the condominiums, the high-end condominiums are facing this so-called bubble. Now, we also know that the central bank is worried about, they're raising concerns of excessive credit flowing into the construction sector. Keeping all of this in mind, if someone comes forward and says, look, we have a property bubble and we are going to be affected by it, and give us a deadline or a date to say in 2022 we are going to face this, is that a realistic argument to bring about, or is it something, as you said, rumour or just hearsay?
It's extremely difficult to put an exact timeline on these things. You have to bear in mind that the real estate market in Sri Lanka is still an emerging market status since the cessation of the civil hostilities in 2009. So really the market is less than 10 years old. In other geographies, I've transacted real estate where the deeds could be traced back to the Middle Ages or to even earlier in the UK. And in other geographies, such as the Middle East, I've transacted properties that didn't exist. The land didn't exist, nor the property. So Sri Lanka falls somewhere in between those two parameters. The issue is centred really on the high-end condominium sector, where absorption rates are currently 50%, which means basically 50% of the stock or the inventory is still available. However, it's further complicated by the fact that the market is predominantly, almost exclusively Sri Lankan. 95% of all condominium sales are to Sri Lankans, be that expatriate or resident. The breakup is roughly 55-60% expatriate. Resident and 30-40% expatriate. But of those 95%, 90% are funding the purchase without leverage, without borrowing.
Right.
So they're funding the stage payments with cash. So the flow of borrowing of debt into the high-end sector is very minimal.
Yeah.
The problem, the challenge is oversupply currently. As I say, with recent releases of new projects, the absorption rate has declined from 65% to 50%. And without a wide international market, without the regulatory framework to encourage foreign investors on an individual private scale, the absorption rates are going to remain fairly static. So in response to that, developers slow down the pace of development.
When you mean, I need to disturb you, when you mean absorption rate, what does that mean?
The units, the inventory that is currently sold or under offer.
So we have more than what is required now, is what you're trying to say?
What I'm saying is the current absorption rate has declined from 65% to 50%, mainly due to the launch of big new projects.
Right.
But obviously that is not sustainable. There is no regulatory framework, or the playing field is not level to encourage foreign individual investors. So developers will respond to the slowing down in absorption by slowing down their development project, the pace of development, or cancelling new starts until the slack is taken out of the market. That could take 2, 3, 4, 5 years, coming back to your original question. So the next 3 to 5 years in the high-end sector will be challenging. There are stresses in the market. There are what we call secondary stock, previously purchased, not yet delivered, coming back onto the market at original purchase price, or OPP. That means that investor has taken a hit. After costs and time value of money, that investor has taken a hit. Other developers are beginning to incentivize by free gifts and holidays and cars, which are the first indicators of stresses in the market. So, but you have to bear in mind there are different sectors within the condominium sector, and the market is cyclical. So different sectors are at different points of their cycle. The high-end sector is at the top end of its cycle, whereas affordable housing, low-cost housing and the middle sector are entering into a growth phase. So overall, sentiment is confidence is high, sentiment is good, and the prospects remain positive.
With that, Mr. Mays, we have to go into a short commercial break. We will be right back. Welcome back. You are watching Biz1st Review 360. We are in discussion with Mr. Stephen Mays, the Managing Director of Jones Lang LaSalle Lanka Private Limited, regarding the property boom. And before the break, we discussed as to what is exactly happening, and that we cannot put a timeline or a deadline for what is happening because of the data, availability of data, so on and so forth. But my question to you, Mr. Mays, is when the government is carrying out infrastructure development projects around certain areas, especially if you take a look at these highways that are coming up, buildings, so on and so forth, the property around that area, the land value of that area, or the value of the buildings in that area tend to go up. Is that considered an artificial boom, or what's happening there?
Interesting question. There have been many studies carried out on that subject. As far as Colombo is concerned, the Southern Expressway extension out of Colombo to Gaul and beyond has demonstrated that access to previously difficult to reach real estate has risen dramatically. Overall, on a global basis, many studies have been done. I was doing some research this morning into South America, North America and Europe, and on average, close to a light railway transport infrastructure improvement, residential prices rise 6 to 7%. So that's a proven fact. Funnily enough, or perhaps less likely to be immediately apparent, commercial property prices rise faster than residential prices when infrastructure improves. So very quick to follow on the heels of residential development is commercial development, retail and office, and those land prices and asset prices rise faster than residential. Everybody in Colombo is rightly talking about the LRT, which is partly a responsibility, partly due to the port city and the infrastructure there, the multinodal hub at Fort, and a lot of speculation is already taking place in the market for land prices in suburbs like Malabe, Battaramulla and Rajagiria. Land prices there have risen respectively 16 to 20% in the last 12 months. Right. So people are already factoring that into their thinking, and developers are obviously taking not advantage but making hay while the sun shines and developing in those districts. Obviously one struggles to predict accurately when the LRT will arrive in those districts, but it's a proven dynamic within the property sector that improved infrastructure leads to increased prices.
In your experience, if I'm to ask you to provide me with an international example as to when an issue like this has cropped up in another country, can you give me an example?
Absolutely. I'm from England. The M25 is 30 years old, or was 30 years old in 2016. Since the M25 arrived, which is an orbital freeway around around London, prices over 30 years have risen 551%, an average of 6% per annum. So yes, that's a very good example. I was studying Stockholm this morning. Property prices, when a new railway extension to one of the inaccessible suburbs rose 30% in 24 months. So yes, there is clear evidence of dramatic, significant property rises. Yes. And
this, if once again an international example to when inflows have gone into the excessive credit flowing has gone into the construction sector, and that has created an effect in other countries.
Well, yes. I mean, the classic example is again the UK back in 2009, when external factors on top of high interest rates forced property prices to tumble dramatically. Interest rates rose from a manageable 7, 8, 9% to 15, 16% overnight, right. And the knock-on effect, personally and business-wise, commercially, was catastrophic. Right. So yes, the government, the central bank, are absolutely right to keep a close eye on the bank exposure to the property sector, to the construction sector. But as I say, at 34% in 2015, now 25%, that's not excessive. It's not a bubble. Bubbles are inflated by credit, and there's not currently too much credit in the market. As I say, the picture is slightly clouded by the lending to the SME sector that may be diverted into real estate. So one can't be 100% accurate. But with the advent of information technology and digital information, it really shouldn't be that difficult for the government to facilitate a digital centralised land registry with public access to that information, and then we'd all know exactly what the picture was, as we do in more established markets. Thank you. One has to bear in mind, forgive me, that this is still a 10-year-old market, so we have to give some credit where credit is due. The market here has come a long way in 10 years and has still got a long way to go.
Thank you, Mr. Mays, for joining us this evening and talking to us about this so-called bubble in the property market, the real estate market, and we hope to see you again on an interesting show like this in the future. Thank you very much.
And that's it from Biz1st Review 360 for tonight. Until next week, have a good night and God bless.